Some folks say that healing comes when you least expect it. For Clay Dawson, it arrived on 4 silent paws one autumn morning. Clay had been alone in his Colorado Valley since losing his younger brother in a hunting accident decades ago. He'd built walls around his heart, higher than the mountains surrounding him. But when a mountain lion emerged from the forest and placed her dying cub at his weathered boots, something shifted. Instead of fear, Clay felt an old, familiar pull, the protective instinct that had made him his brother's keeper. What happened next would challenge everything the local community believed about wild creatures and broken men. How do you rebuild a life when wilderness asks you to care? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's harsh buzz never woke Clay Dawson anymore. 30 years of rising before dawn had trained his body to stir naturally at 4:30, when the mountain air still held the night's chill and the first hint of light barely kissed the eastern peaks. His cabin sat in a pocket of the San Juan Mountains, so remote that the nearest neighbor lived 12 miles down a dirt road that turned to mud every spring and froze solid every winter. Clay swung his legs over the edge of his narrow bed, bare feet finding the cold wooden floor. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchen that barely deserved the name, but it suited him. He'd built most of it himself, after buying the 20-acre plot with money from his father's estate, back when he still thought he might want neighbors someday, above the stone fireplace. His brother Tom's hunting rifle hung on wooden pegs their grandfather had carved. The Winchester Model 70 gleamed despite decades of disuse, its walnut stock polished to a warm amber. Clay cleaned it religiously every month, though he hadn't fired a shot since the accident. The rifle watched over his morning routine like a silent judge, its presence both comfort and torment. Coffee first. Always coffee. Clay measured grounds with the precision of ritual, filling the ancient percolator with water from the hand pump at his kitchen sink. The cabin had no electricity, by choice, not necessity. He could have run power lines years ago, but the generators and solar panels he'd installed served his needs. The hiss and bubble of coffee brewing on the propane stove marked the true beginning of each day. While the coffee worked its magic, Clay stepped onto his covered porch and surveyed his domain. The valley stretched before him like a green carpet, bisected by Clear Creek, which ran crystal cold and fast, even in late September. Aspen trees dotted the mountainsides, their leaves turning that brilliant gold that made tourists drive hundreds of miles for photographs. But Clay saw past the beauty to the practical details. The fence line along his southern boundary needed repair. The hay in his small pasture was ready for the last cutting. And the weather had that brittle quality that meant snow within the week. His 4 goats, Jenny, Dolly, May, and Bessie, waited by their pen, patient as church ladies. They were his primary source of companionship, though he'd never admit it aloud. The Nubian had good temperaments, and gave enough milk for his coffee and the occasional batch of cheese. They also served a more practical purpose. Mountain lions and bears generally avoided areas where livestock grazed. Usually, Clay pulled on his work jacket, a faded denim thing that had seen better decades, and walked to the barn. The morning routine never varied. Feed the goats, check their water, examine each animal for injury or illness. Simple tasks that anchored him to the world when his mind threatened to drift back 30 years to that October morning when everything changed. Tom had been 22 then, bright and eager, and convinced that hunting elk with his older brother would prove he'd become a man. Clay had been 28, already set in his bachelor ways, working construction in Durango and saving money for his own piece of land. Their father had died the previous winter, leaving them a modest inheritance and a pair of rifles that had belonged to their grandfather. "Come on." "Clay," Tom had said, bouncing on his toes like he used to do as a kid. "One trip, just you and me, like Dad always talked about." Clay had resisted at first. He'd never been much of a hunter, preferring to observe wildlife rather than kill it. But Tom had that earnest look that could wear down granite, and their father had always promised they'd make that trip together someday. So Clay had said yes, thinking it would be a bonding experience, a way to honor their father's memory. The irony still cut deep. It had been a bonding experience, all right. Bonded them together in tragedy for the rest of Tom's short life. The accident replayed in Clay's mind with merciless clarity as he measured oats for the goats. They'd been tracking a bull elk through dense timber, moving single file along a game trail. Clay had been in front, rifle ready, when he'd heard something large crashing through the underbrush to their left. He'd swung around, finger moving to the trigger, and in that split second of turning, he'd seen Tom stepping into his line of fire. The shot had been meant for the elk. Instead, it had found his brother. Tom had lived long enough for Clay to carry him 3 miles to the truck, long enough for the frantic drive to the hospital, long enough to squeeze Clay's hand and whisper, "Not your fault, brother, not your fault." But fault had nothing to do with the weight that settled on Clay's chest that day and never lifted. The funeral had been a blur of casseroles and condolences. Their mother had died years earlier, so it was just Clay and a handful of extended family he barely knew. Tom's girlfriend Sarah, just 18 and heartbroken, had clung to Clay's arm and sobbed. She'd been pregnant, though none of them knew it then. The baby, a girl they'd name after her father's memory, would grow up knowing her father only through stories. Clay had tried to maintain contact with Sarah and little Sarah after the funeral, but every interaction felt like picking at a wound. Sarah, who'd become Sarah Martinez after marrying a good man from Taos, had eventually stopped calling, stopped sending photos of the daughter who had Tom's dark hair and easy smile. Clay had let her go, telling himself it was for the best. Now, 3 decades later, that little girl would be nearly 30 herself. Clay wondered sometimes if she had children of her own, if she ever thought about the uncle who'd disappeared from her life before she was old enough to remember him. But wondering led to dwelling, and dwelling led to the kind of pain that could swallow a man whole. The goats finished their breakfast and scattered across the pasture, bells tinkling softly around their necks. Clay checked their water trough, noting that the level had dropped more than usual overnight. Something had been drinking here, something larger than his goats. He knelt and examined the muddy ground around the trough. There, pressed deep into the soft earth, was a paw print the size of his spread hand, round with 4 distinct toe pads and no claw marks visible. Mountain lion and a big one, female most likely, based on the size and depth of the impression. Clay felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with any reminder of large predators. He'd seen plenty of lions over the years, ghostly shadows at the edge of his vision, tracks in fresh snow, the occasional glimpse of a tawny form slipping through the trees. But they'd always maintained the respectful distance that wild creatures and isolated humans observed. This print was less than 50 yards from his cabin. He stood slowly, scanning the tree line with practiced eyes. Mountain lions rarely attacked humans, but a hungry female with cubs might be more desperate than usual. The late season had been dry, game animals had moved to higher elevations following the snow line, and winter was coming early this year. Desperation made even the most cautious animals dangerous. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the aspen leaves like scattered gold coins. Clay's breath misted in the thin air as he walked back to the cabin, the paw print troubling his thoughts. Inside, he poured himself a second cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching the meadow where the goats grazed. Tom's rifle caught the morning light, and for a moment, Clay could almost hear his brother's voice. "Come on." "Clay, what's the worst that could happen?" The worst that could happen. Clay had learned that lesson 30 years ago, learned it with a finality that had shaped every day since. The worst that could happen was that you could lose the one person who mattered most to you. Lose them to your own carelessness, your own moment of inattention. He'd built this life, this careful, controlled, solitary life, to make sure the worst couldn't happen again. No attachments meant no one to lose. No risks meant no chances for devastating mistakes. It was a small life, measured in coffee cups and goat bells and the reliable cycle of seasons, but it was safe. The paw print in the mud suggested that safety might be an illusion, but Clay had been living with illusions for 3 decades. What was one more? He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup in the hand pump sink, and reached for his work gloves. The hay wouldn't cut itself, and the fence line wouldn't repair itself. And the winter wouldn't wait for him to wrestle with memories that never quite stayed buried. But as he walked back toward the barn, Clay couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the tree line. Something large and patient and desperate enough to drink from a domestic water trough 50 yards from a human dwelling. Something with cubs to protect. Dawn came earlier than usual the next morning, not because the sun rose sooner, but because Clay found himself wide awake at 3:30, listening to sounds that didn't belong to his familiar world. Something was moving in the yard, not the casual wandering of his goats, but the deliberate, careful placement of paws on frost-hardened earth. He lay still in his narrow bed, hardly breathing, while his mind catalogued possibilities. Bear, maybe, though it was late in the season for them to be wandering rather than seeking their winter dens. Elk sometimes wandered through the valley, but they moved differently, with the heavy certainty of animals that feared little. This was something else, something that moved like flowing water, silent and purposeful. The goats had gone quiet. That was never a good sign. Clay slipped from bed without letting the springs creak, his bare feet finding the cold floor with practiced silence. He'd learned stealth during his years alone, not from any military training or hunting expertise, but from the simple desire to observe the world around him without disturbing it. Wildlife revealed its secrets only to those who could become part of the landscape. He crept to the kitchen window and peered through a gap in the curtains. The yard lay silver under starlight, frost glittering on every surface like scattered diamonds. His breath fogged the glass as he searched for movement, for the source of the disturbance that had woken him. There, by the goat pen, a shadow that didn't match the fence posts or water trough. As his eyes adjusted, the shadow resolved into something that made his heart skip. A mountain lion, large and female, sitting motionless as a statue. She faced the cabin directly, her pale eyes catching what little light the stars provided. Clay's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle rack by the door, then stopped. The lion wasn't stalking. She wasn't crouched in hunting posture or showing any sign of aggression. She was simply waiting with the infinite patience of a wild creature that had learned to survive by choosing her moments carefully. The goats huddled together at the far end of their pen, bunched tight but not panicked. If the lion had meant them harm, they would have been screaming. Instead, they watched with the wary alertness of prey animals that sensed danger but not immediate threat. Clay grabbed his jacket and his grandfather's old work boots, moving with the slow deliberation that had become second nature. He'd learned that sudden movements in the presence of wild animals led to regret more often than to safety. Better to be prepared than to startle a predator into acting on instinct. The front door opened without its usual creak. He'd oiled the hinges just last week. Another of those small maintenance tasks that filled his days. Cool air rushed past him, carrying the scent of frost and pine and something else, the wild musk of the big cat and, underneath it, the smell of milk and fear. The mountain lion's ears twitched at the sound of the door, but she didn't move. Clay stepped onto the porch, his boots loud against the wooden planks despite his efforts at quiet. Still the lion waited, and in that waiting, Clay began to understand that this encounter was different from any wildlife experience he'd had in 30 years of mountain living. "Easy. A girl," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "What brings you calling so early?" The lion's response was to rise from her sitting position and pad forward 3 careful steps. As she moved, Clay saw what she carried in her mouth. A small, limp form that hung like a bundle of wet fur. A cub, barely larger than a house cat, its tiny body motionless. Clay's breath caught. Mountain lions were solitary creatures, fiercely protective of their young. A mother would never bring her cub near human habitation unless something was desperately wrong. But here she stood, less than 20 feet from his porch, holding what appeared to be a dying baby in her jaws. She took another step forward. then carefully, deliberately lowered her head and placed the cub on the frozen ground. The small body didn't move, didn't make a sound. Clay could see its ribs through the thin fur, could see the way its head lolled at an unnatural angle. The mother lion backed away 3 steps and sat again, her eyes never leaving Clay's face. The message was unmistakable. Here is my baby. Help him. Clay had read about this behavior in nature documentaries and wildlife magazines. Desperate animals sometimes sought help from the species that usually threatened them. He'd always thought it was exaggerated, anthropomorphized storytelling designed to tug at human heartstrings. But here was the reality. Sitting in his front yard under the fading stars, the cub was dying, maybe already dead, and its mother had brought it to the only source of help she knew, the strange 2-legged creature who lived in the wooden den and shared his water with other animals. Clay's logical mind screamed warnings. Mountain lions were apex predators, capable of killing a grown man with a single swipe of their powerful paws. A protective mother was among the most dangerous animals on Earth. Getting between a lion and her cub, even to help, violated every rule of wildlife safety he'd ever learned. But the cub hadn't moved since being placed on the ground, and the mother's behavior suggested desperation rather than aggression. Clay found himself stepping down from the porch, moving slowly but steadily toward the tiny form on the frozen earth. "Let me see him, Mama," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let me try to help." The lion tensed as he approached, her powerful muscles bunching under her tawny coat. But she didn't flee, didn't attack. She watched with the focused intensity of a mother who had exhausted all other options. Clay knelt beside the cub, close enough to the lion that he could have reached out and touched her. She was magnificent up close, easily 120 pounds of perfectly designed predator, her coat unmarked by scars, her eyes bright with intelligence and fear. This close, he could hear her breathing, could smell the wild scent of her and see the slight tremor in her flanks that spoke of exhaustion and stress. The cub was still alive, but barely. Its breathing was so shallow, Clay had to put his ear near its tiny muzzle to hear it. The little body was cold, much too cold, and when he gently lifted it, he could feel the sharp edges of ribs through the thin fur. Malnutrition, hypothermia, and something else, a weakness that suggested illness or injury. "He's sick, isn't he?" Clay said to the mother, who had crept closer while he examined her baby. "You've been trying to keep him alive, but you're losing him." The lion's response was a soft sound, almost a chirp, that Clay had never heard a big cat make. It was the sound of a mother calling to her young, a sound that transcended species in its meaning. Clay looked up into her pale eyes and made a decision that would have terrified him if he'd stopped to think about it. Instead of thinking, he acted on instinct, the same protective instinct that had made him carry his wounded brother 3 miles through mountain wilderness. The same instinct that had driven him to build walls around his heart to prevent further loss. "I'll try," he told her. "I can't promise anything, but I'll try." He stood slowly, the cub cradled against his chest, and walked toward the cabin. The lion followed, matching his pace, but maintaining a careful distance. At the porch steps, Clay turned back to her. "You can wait if you want," he said. "But you can't come inside. Too small, too many things that could scare him worse." Inside the cabin, Clay moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to solving practical problems. The cub needed warmth first. He wrapped it in an old flannel shirt, one he'd worn for years until the elbows wore through, soft now from countless washings. The shirt held his scent, familiar and non-threatening, and the cub's breathing seemed to ease slightly against the warm fabric. Milk next. He'd raised orphaned animals before. A deer fawn, whose mother had been killed by a car, a clutch of baby rabbits found after a fox attack. Goat's milk was rich and nutritious, close enough to lion's milk to sustain the cub if it would drink. He warmed the milk carefully, testing the temperature against his wrist the way he'd seen mothers do with formula. Too hot would burn the cub's mouth. Too cold would provide no comfort. The ancient skills of nurturing came back to him, as if he'd never stopped using them. Outside, he could hear the mother lion pacing, the soft pad of paws on frost, the occasional soft call. She was close, close enough to crash through his windows if she chose, but Clay found he wasn't afraid. Fear had been replaced by something older and more powerful, the drive to protect something small and helpless. The cub's eyes opened as Clay dripped warm milk onto its tiny tongue. They were blue, the muddy blue of all baby mammals, and unfocused with weakness. But when the milk touched its mouth, some primitive instinct kicked in, and it began to suck. Tiny paws kneading weakly against the flannel shirt. "That's it," Clay whispered, settling into his kitchen chair with the cub in his lap. "Take your time. We've got all the time in the world." Through the window, he could see the mother lion lying in his yard, her great head resting on her paws as she watched the cabin. She was trusting him with the most precious thing in her world, and Clay felt the weight of that trust, like a physical pressure in his chest. The cub drank slowly, pausing frequently to rest. Its tiny body gradually warmed against Clay's chest, and the desperate quality of its breathing eased into something more natural. Not healthy yet, not strong, but alive in a way it hadn't been when its mother placed it on the frozen ground. As the first real light of dawn crept through his windows, Clay realized that his carefully constructed solitary life had just been irrevocably changed. The mountain lion outside represented everything he'd spent 30 years avoiding: connection, responsibility, the possibility of loss. But as the cub's tiny paw curled around his finger with surprising strength, Clay found he didn't care about the risks. For the first time in decades, something needed him to live rather than simply survive. The flannel shirt, soft with age and memory, had become a nest for new life. And Clay Dawson, hermit of the San Juan Mountains, had become a father again. Sleep became a luxury Clay could no longer afford. The cub, he'd started thinking of it as Little Bear, though he hadn't spoken the name aloud, needed feeding every 2 hours around the clock. Between feedings there was warming, cleaning, and the constant monitoring that kept death at bay for something so small and vulnerable. By noon of the first day, Clay's kitchen table had been transformed into a makeshift nursery. The flannel shirt served as bedding inside a cardboard box lined with towels. A heating pad, one of his few electrical luxuries, provided steady warmth. Empty goat milk bottles accumulated on the counter like evidence of his growing commitment, each one representing another small victory in the battle to keep the cub alive. He'd fashioned a feeding bottle from an old eyedropper and rubber tubing, creating a nipple small enough for the cub's tiny mouth. The process was painstaking: warm the milk, test the temperature, position the cub, coax it to drink. Some feedings took an hour, with the cub taking only a few drops before falling back into exhausted sleep. The mother lion had settled into a routine of her own. She spent the daylight hours in a thick stand of pine trees, 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to watch, but far enough to avoid making the cub panic with her scent. Clay caught glimpses of her golden coat through the branches, a constant reminder that this arrangement was temporary, or should be, but temporary had a way of becoming permanent. When caring for something helpless, the second morning brought another test of Clay's resolve. He woke before dawn to check on Little Bear and found the cub breathing easier, its tiny body warm against the flannel. Progress, real progress that made his chest tighten with something he'd forgotten how to feel. Hope. That hope was tested an hour later when he heard the mother lion's soft call from the yard. Clay stepped onto the porch and found her standing near the water trough, another small form at her feet. This cub was larger than the first, with the spotted coat that would fade as it matured, but it was just as weak, just as close to death. "Another one?" Clay asked the lion, who had already backed away to her watching distance. "How many babies are you carrying out there, Mama?" The second cub, he'd think of this one as Spot, for the distinctive markings along its flank proved even more challenging than the first. It was stronger, which meant it was more difficult to handle, but also sicker, which meant it fought the feeding process with what little energy it had. Clay found himself wrestling with a creature no bigger than a house cat that possessed the determined stubbornness of its species. By the third day, Clay's routine had expanded to accommodate 2 patients. He'd moved his makeshift nursery to the living room, closer to the fireplace for warmth. The cardboard box had given way to a wooden crate padded with every spare blanket he owned. His kitchen counter looked like a medical supply depot. Bottles, droppers, thermometer, clean towels, and the growing collection of empty milk containers that marked each successful feeding. The physical exhaustion was manageable. Clay had worked harder in his construction days, putting in 12-hour shifts under the desert sun. But the emotional exhaustion was something else entirely. Every labored breath from the cubs sent a spike of anxiety through his chest. Every time one of them felt cooler or warmer than usual, he found himself checking and rechecking, watching for signs of improvement or decline. It reminded him too much of those final hours with Tom, that helpless vigil where love and determination meant nothing against the simple fact of mortality. The difference was that Tom had been dying despite Clay's efforts, while the cubs were living because of them. But the weight of responsibility felt the same, the crushing awareness that other lives depended on choices he made, actions he took or failed to take. "You're getting soft, old man," he told himself on the 4th morning, but the words lacked conviction. Soft wasn't the right word for what was happening to him. It was more like awakening, as if muscles that had been tensed for 3 decades were finally learning to relax. The cubs had begun to show distinct personalities. Little Bear was the patient one, accepting food and handling without fuss, sleeping quietly between feedings. Spot was the fighter, squirming during every interaction, protesting each feeding with tiny mewls that were probably meant to be fierce roars. But both were getting stronger, their breathing easier, their bodies warmer and more responsive. Clay had started talking to them during feedings, a one-sided conversation that helped pass the time and seemed to calm them. He told them about the valley, about the goats, about the changing seasons, and the way snow would transform their world in a few weeks. He didn't tell them about Tom, about the years of isolation, about the walls he'd built around his heart. Some stories were too heavy for creatures learning to trust the world. On the 5th morning, the conversation became more urgent. Clay woke to find Little Bear listless and unresponsive, its breathing shallow and irregular. The cub's temperature had dropped despite the heating pad, and it showed no interest in the milk Clay offered. "Come on, little one," Clay whispered, gently massaging the tiny chest. "Don't quit on me now. You've come too far to give up." For an hour, he worked over the cub with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd lost too much already. Warming, feeding, stimulating circulation with gentle massage. The techniques came from instinct and half-remembered advice from veterinary manuals he'd read years ago when caring for injured wildlife. The breakthrough came just as Clay was beginning to lose hope. Little Bear's eyes opened, focused on Clay's face, and the cub made a sound that was part purr, part squeak. A sound of recognition, of trust. The breathing steadied, the body temperature stabilized, and the tiny mouth began to work against the makeshift nipple. "That's it," Clay said, his voice rougher than usual. "That's my brave boy." The moment of crisis passed, but it left Clay shaken in ways he didn't expect. He'd cared for injured animals before, but this was different. These cubs weren't just wildlife he was helping. They were becoming something more. Family, maybe? Responsibility that went beyond simple compassion. That afternoon brought the 3rd test. Clay was adjusting the cub's bedding when he heard the mother lion's call from the yard. But this time she wasn't alone. Through the window he could see 2 forms approaching, the mother and another cub, this one moving under its own power but clearly weak. 3, Clay said to himself. Then laughed, the first real laugh he'd managed in years. "She's got 3 babies out there, and she's bringing them all to me." The 3rd cub, smaller than Spot but larger than Little Bear, with the pale coat that would darken with age, didn't require carrying. It walked to Clay's porch on unsteady legs, looked up at him with bright eyes, and began to climb the steps with the determination of a creature that knew where it wanted to be. "Well, hello there, Tiny," Clay said, kneeling to scoop up the newest arrival. "Come to join the family?" This cub was in better condition than the other two, weak from hunger, but not from illness. It took to the bottle immediately, drinking with the focused intensity of an animal that had learned what survival required. But it was also the most skittish, flinching at sudden sounds and watching Clay with wary intelligence. By evening, Clay's living room had been completely transformed. 3 cubs shared the wooden crate, curled together in a furry pile that rose and fell with their synchronized breathing. The kitchen counter held enough bottles and supplies to stock a small veterinary clinic. The mother lion had taken up residence under the large pine tree, close enough to hear her baby's calls, far enough to give Clay space to work. Clay sat in his grandfather's old rocking chair, watching the cubs sleep and listening to the soft sounds of their breathing. His body ached from days of irregular sleep and constant vigilance. His heart ached too, but in a different way, with the sweet pain of caring too much, risking too much, allowing hope to take root in ground he'd thought was too hard to support new growth. The empty milk bottles on his counter told the story better than words. Each feeding, each small victory, each step away from the safe isolation he'd maintained for 30 years. He was no longer just Clay Dawson, hermit of the mountains. He was becoming something else, protector, provider, the human anchor for 3 small lives that had chosen to trust him. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, large flakes that caught the firelight through his windows. Winter was coming, and these cubs would need more than milk and warmth to survive. They would need a sanctuary, a safe place to grow strong enough to return to the wild. Clay looked around his small cabin, calculating space and resources and the 1,000 practical details that would need attention. The cubs stirred in their shared sleep, Tiny's paw reaching out to touch Little Bear's flank, Spot's head pillowing on his brother's back. "Looks like we're going to need a bigger place," Clay said softly. And for the first time in 3 decades, the prospect of change didn't terrify him. It excited him. Clay had always been a practical man who understood that 3 growing mountain lion cubs would require more resources than his small cabin could provide. The trip to Silverbrook, the nearest town, became inevitable when his supply of goat milk ran low, and the cubs showed no signs of slowing their appetites. The drive down the mountain took 40 minutes on good days, but the early snow had made the dirt road treacherous. Clay's old pickup truck handled the conditions well enough, though he drove more carefully than usual. The cubs were 6 days old now, or rather 6 days into their new lives with him, and leaving them for even a few hours felt like abandoning his post. He'd fashioned a better enclosure before leaving, using chicken wire and wooden boards to create a secure pen in his living room. The mother lion had watched his preparations from her pine tree, her golden eyes tracking his every movement. She'd grown bolder over the past few days, approaching the cabin during feeding times, sometimes settling within 20 feet of the windows. Close enough that Clay could hear her soft vocalizations to her cubs, a running commentary that sounded like encouragement. Silverbrook hadn't changed much in the 3 years since Clay's last visit. Main Street still boasted more pickup trucks than cars, more feed stores than coffee shops. The hardware store occupied the same corner building where his grandfather had bought supplies 50 years ago, and Morrison's Market still had the best selection of anything edible within 100 miles. Clay's first stop was the market, where he loaded his cart with powdered milk formula, canned goat milk, and enough supplies to feed 3 rapidly growing predators. The checkout girl, he thought her name was Amy, though he couldn't be sure, rang up his purchases with the practiced disinterest of small-town retail. "Planning to feed an army, Mr. Dawson?" she asked, noting the quantity of milk products. "Something like that," Clay replied, which was true enough. His second stop was the feed store, where he bought vitamins and supplements recommended for carnivorous animals. The owner, Mike Patterson, had known Clay's father and always took time for conversation. "Haven't seen you in a while," Mike said, loading 50-pound sacks of various animal feeds into Clay's truck. "How are things up in the valley?" "Quiet," Clay said. "Been taking care of some orphaned animals." "What kind of orphans?" Clay hesitated, then decided on partial truth. Cats lost their mother. House cats. In this weather? Hell, Clay, they'll freeze if you don't bring them in. Already done that. They're doing fine, Mike nodded approvingly. Always figured you for the type to help strays. Your father was the same way. The conversation might have ended there, but Mrs. Henderson from the post office had been listening from the next aisle. She emerged with a knowing smile and the eager expression of someone who'd just acquired interesting gossip. Cats, you said? How many? 3, Clay admitted. Well, that's very kind of you, Clay. Not many men would take in strays, especially wild ones. Something in her tone made Clay look at her more sharply. What do you mean, wild ones? Oh, Jimmy Reeves mentioned seeing a mountain lion up your way last week. Said it looked like a female, probably with cubs. You haven't seen her, have you? Clay's mouth went dry. Jimmy Reeves ran a hunting guide service and knew the mountains as well as anyone. If he'd spotted the mother lion, word would spread quickly through the valley's small community. Can't say I have, Clay said, which was technically true. He'd been too busy with the cubs to pay much attention to the mother's movements. But Mrs. Henderson had the scent of a story now. Jimmy thought it was strange, her being so close to your place. Mountain lions usually avoid humans, you know, unless they're desperate or protecting something. Clay finished loading his supplies and left the feed store with the uncomfortable knowledge that his secret was already half exposed. Small towns thrived on speculation, and the combination of an unusual mountain lion and Clay's sudden need for large quantities of milk would soon add up to conclusions that were remarkably close to the truth. The drive back up the mountain felt longer than usual. Clay's mind worked through contingencies, trying to anticipate problems before they arrived at his door. Wildlife officials would be the first concern. They had authority to remove dangerous animals from private property. Then there would be safety inspectors, health officials, maybe even law enforcement if someone decided the cubs posed a public threat. But when Clay pulled into his yard and heard the soft mewling of healthy cubs from inside the cabin, his worries receded. Whatever was coming, he'd deal with it. The cubs were stronger now, more alert, beginning to show the curiosity and playfulness that marked healthy development. That was worth almost any amount of bureaucratic hassle. The mother lion emerged from her pine trees as Clay unloaded his supplies. She'd grown more comfortable with his routine, approaching within 15 feet as he carried boxes into the cabin. This close, Clay could see that she was thin, not starving, but showing the strain of nursing 3 cubs while hunting enough to maintain her own strength. Been taking care of your babies. Mama, he told her, same as he did every day. They're getting big and strong. Inside, the cubs had made impressive progress during his absence. They'd managed to climb out of their pen, which explained the overturned water bowl and scattered towels, and had explored the living room with the destructive enthusiasm of healthy young predators. Nothing was damaged, but everything soft had been thoroughly investigated, chewed, and claimed as potential bedding. "Miss me, did you?" Clay asked, gathering the escaped cubs and returning them to their enclosure. They responded with purrs and the tiny chirping sounds that served as their version of conversation. Little Bear had grown bold enough to climb Clay's arm when picked up, tiny claws finding purchase in his flannel shirt. Spot had developed a habit of pouncing on anything that moved, including his brother's tails. Tiny remained the most cautious, but had begun to seek out physical contact, pressing against Clay's hand during feeding times. The afternoon feeding went smoothly, each cub taking its turn with the bottle, while the others dozed in the pile of blankets that had become their preferred sleeping arrangement. Clay found himself humming while he worked, an old song his mother used to sing, something about sunshine and mountain mornings. He hadn't hummed in years, hadn't even realized he remembered the tune. His peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle coming up the mountain road. Clay set down the feeding bottle and moved to the window, his stomach tightening as he recognized the official markings on the approaching truck. Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Bill Rawlings had been elected 3 times running. less for his law enforcement skills than for his reputation as a reasonable man who understood mountain folk and their ways. He was also Clay's age, which meant he remembered the Dawson family from better days. Clay stepped onto the porch to meet him, leaving the cubs safely inside. Behind him, he could hear soft mewling as they protested the interruption to their feeding schedule. "Afternoon." "Clay," Bill said, climbing out of his truck with the careful movements of a man who'd spent too many hours behind a steering wheel. "Mind if we talk for a few minutes?" "Always welcome here, Bill. Coffee?" "Thanks, but this isn't exactly a social call." Bill glanced toward the cabin, where the cubs' vocalizations were becoming more insistent. "Got a call from Jimmy Reeves. He's been guiding some hunters up this way, and they've reported unusual activity around your property." "What kind of activity?" "Mountain lion. Big female. Jimmy thinks she's denned up somewhere close by, maybe with cubs." "That's got folks worried, Clay. Lion with babies can be unpredictable." Clay kept his expression neutral. "Haven't seen any lions myself. What about those sounds?" "That's not house cats I'm hearing." The cubs chose that moment to begin what Clay had come to recognize as their hunger chorus. 3 distinct voices demanding attention with increasing volume. The sounds were definitely feline, but too deep and too wild to belong to any domestic animal. Bill's expression shifted from friendly concern to professional wariness. "Clay, what exactly do you have in that cabin?" Before Clay could answer, the mother lion appeared at the edge of the yard. She'd been sleeping in the pine trees when Bill arrived, but the sound of unfamiliar voices had brought her closer. Now she stood 40 feet away, easily visible, watching the 2 humans with the focused intensity of a predator evaluating a threat. "Jesus Christ," Bill breathed, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "That's a big cat." "Easy," Clay said, stepping slightly between the sheriff and the lion. "She's not aggressive. She's just protective." "Protective of what?" But even as Bill asked the question, understanding was dawning in his eyes. The sounds from the cabin, the mother lion's proximity, Clay's defensive stance, it all pointed to the same impossible conclusion. "You've got her cubs," Bill said. It wasn't a question. Clay looked at his friend, this man who'd grown up in the same mountains, who understood the complex relationship between humans and wildlife that defined their lives. He could lie, could try to maintain the fiction that had already begun to crumble. Or he could trust that Bill would understand the choice Clay had made. 3 of them, Clay said quietly. "They were dying, Bill. She brought them to me." The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, then at the mother lion, who had settled into a watchful crouch, but showed no signs of leaving. "Brought them to you," Bill repeated, "6 days ago. The first one was barely alive. The others weren't much better. And you decided to play nursemaid to 3 mountain lion cubs. I decided to try to keep them alive." Bill was quiet for a long moment, studying Clay's face, weighing what he'd heard against what he knew about the man who'd become a hermit after losing his brother. When he spoke again, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trying to balance friendship with professional duty. "Clay, you know I can't just walk away from this. Mountain lions are protected, but there are protocols. Wildlife officials will need to be involved. Safety inspections, probably relocation of the animals. They're not ready for relocation. They're still too young, too weak. That's not my call to make. And it's not yours either." The cubs' voices rose again from inside the cabin, hungry and insistent. The mother lion's ears twitched at the sound, and she took 2 steps closer to the porch. "How long do I have?" Clay asked. "I need to make some calls when I get back to town. Probably be someone out here tomorrow, maybe the day after." Bill paused, studying Clay's face. "You know this can't end well, don't you? Best case scenario, they take the cubs to a wildlife facility. Worst case, someone decides they're too dangerous to relocate." Clay felt something cold settle in his chest. "They're babies, Bill. They're not dangerous to anyone." "Tell that to their mother." As if summoned by his words, the lion rose and padded closer, now less than 20 feet from the 2 men. She was magnificent and terrifying, a perfect example of wilderness power barely contained by maternal restraint. "She's been peaceful," Clay said. 6 days, and she's never shown aggression. She's just watching over her babies. For now. But what happens when those cubs get bigger? What happens when they start acting like the predators they are? Clay didn't have an answer for that, because he'd been trying not to think about it. The cubs were growing fast, doubling in size since their arrival. In a few weeks, they'd be too big for his cabin, too strong for improvised enclosures. Eventually, they'd need to return to the wild, but eventually wasn't today, and today they still needed him. "I'll figure it out, Bill." The sheriff nodded slowly, the expression of a man who'd made difficult decisions before. "I hope you do, Clay. Because tomorrow, this becomes official business. And once it's official, it's out of both our hands." Bill climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving Clay alone with the mountain lion and the impossible choices that lay ahead. Inside the cabin, 3 small voices continued their demands for attention, oblivious to the complications their presence had created. Clay looked at the mother lion, who had watched the entire exchange with the patient attention of someone learning the rules of a new game. "Looks like our quiet life just got complicated, Mama," he told her. The lion's only response was to settle into her watching position, golden eyes fixed on the cabin where her children were learning to trust the world. The knock on Clay's door came at 7 in the morning, interrupting the cubs' breakfast feeding. Little Bear was halfway through his bottle when the sound echoed through the cabin, causing all 3 cubs to freeze with the alert stillness of prey animals sensing danger. Outside, the mother lion melted into the tree line with the fluid grace of a creature that had learned to read human intentions. Clay set down the bottle and moved to the window, expecting to see Sheriff Rawlings returning with wildlife officials in tow. Instead, he found himself looking at a compact Toyota pickup truck with Colorado State University decals and what appeared to be scientific equipment secured in the truck bed. The woman standing on his porch was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of outdoor clothing that spoke of someone who spent time in the field. She carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to working in challenging environments, but there was something familiar about the set of her shoulders, the way she held her head while waiting. When Clay opened the door, recognition hit him like a physical blow. The last time he'd seen Sarah Martinez, she'd been 15 years old and crying at her father's funeral. Now she was a grown woman with her father's serious eyes and her mother's determined chin. But the resemblance to Tom was unmistakable in the shape of her face and the way she tilted her head when thinking. "Hello, Uncle Clay," she said, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. Clay found himself speechless for a moment, caught between the ghost of the girl he'd once known and the professional stranger standing before him. Behind him, the cubs began their impatient chorus again, their hunger overriding any concern about visitors. "Sarah," he managed finally, "it's been a long time. 15 years, she said, since Dad's funeral. The mention of her adoptive father, the good man from Taos who'd married Sarah's mother and raised Tom's daughter as his own, brought back a flood of memories. Clay had attended the funeral, had tried to reconnect with his great niece, but the weight of unspoken history had made conversation impossible. Sarah had been polite, but distant, already showing signs of the independent spirit that would carry her through college and graduate school. "I'm sorry about your father," Clay said, though the words felt inadequate after so many years. He was a good man. Yes, he was. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her professional demeanor remained intact. "May I come in? I understand. You have a situation here that requires immediate attention." Clay hesitated, acutely aware of the cub's vocalizations behind him and the makeshift nursery that had taken over his living room. Letting Sarah into his cabin meant letting her into the carefully constructed world he'd built around the cub's needs. But the sound of another vehicle approaching down the mountain road decided the matter for him. "Officials?" he asked. "Colorado Parks and Wildlife, most likely. I asked them to let me assess the situation first, given our family connection." Sarah studied his face carefully. They weren't entirely happy about the delay, but they agreed to give me an hour. Clay stepped aside, allowing her into the cabin. Sarah entered with the controlled movements of someone trained to observe animal behavior, her eyes taking in every detail of the makeshift sanctuary. The wooden crate lined with blankets, the collection of bottles and feeding supplies, the careful arrangement of heating pads and thermometers, all of it spoke to someone who'd committed fully to keeping difficult animals alive. The cubs greeted her arrival with increased vocalizations, their heads raised above the edge of their enclosure as they studied this new human. Little Bear, now the boldest of the three, attempted to climb out of the crate, his tiny claws scrabbling against the wooden sides. "Mountain lion cubs," Sarah said, and Clay couldn't tell if her tone was impressed or appalled. "How old?" "About a week, maybe a little more. They were dying when their mother brought them to me." Sarah knelt beside the enclosure, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't reach toward the cubs immediately, instead allowing them to become accustomed to her presence. When she finally extended her hand, it was palm up and motionless, letting the cubs choose whether to investigate. Tiny, always the most cautious, was the first to approach. He sniffed Sarah's fingers carefully, his tiny nose working to catalog this new scent. After a moment, he allowed her to stroke his head with one finger, a gesture that spoke to Sarah's understanding of wild animal behavior. "They're remarkably calm around humans," she observed. "That's unusual for mountain lions, even cubs this young. They were almost dead when I got them. I think they associate humans with warmth and food now." Sarah continued her examination, noting the cub's weight, condition, and behavior with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years studying wildlife. She picked up one of the feeding bottles, testing the nipple and checking the temperature of the remaining milk. "Goat milk formula with vitamin supplements," she said. "Good choice, better than cow's milk for carnivore cubs. I looked it up in some old veterinary manuals." "And you've been feeding them around the clock?" "Every 2 hours for the first few days. Now they can go 3 hours between feedings." Sarah's expression was unreadable as she continued her assessment. She checked the cub's makeshift enclosure, noted the heating arrangements, examined the feeding equipment with the thoroughness of someone conducting an official inspection. But her movements around the cubs were gentle, respectful of their wild nature while acknowledging their current vulnerability. "The mother," Sarah said. "Is she still in the area?" "She's watching from the tree line. Never goes far. That's extremely unusual behavior. Mountain lions don't typically seek human help, even in desperate circumstances." Clay moved to the window and pointed toward the pine trees where the mother lion had taken refuge. Sarah joined him, and together they watched the tawny form settle into her customary watching position. "She's been there for a week?" Sarah asked. "Every day. Sometimes she comes closer during feeding times, like she's checking on them." "She's lactating," Sarah observed, noting the mother's condition through binoculars she'd retrieved from her equipment bag. "Still producing milk, which means she's expending significant energy while not getting enough nutrition. She should have abandoned weak cubs to save herself and any stronger offspring, but she didn't. No, she didn't. And that raises some interesting questions about her history and psychological state." Sarah lowered the binoculars and turned to study Clay with the same intensity she'd shown the cubs. "You know this can't continue indefinitely. These cubs will outgrow their current enclosure within weeks. They'll need more space, more specialized care, eventual preparation for release back to the wild." "I know that, do you? Because what I'm seeing here suggests someone who's become very attached to animals that can never be truly domesticated." Clay felt a flare of defensive anger. "I'm not trying to turn them into pets. I'm just trying to keep them alive until they're strong enough to survive on their own. And then what? You release them back to their mother, who's been feeding them by proxy through you for a week? You think they'll remember how to be wild after being raised by a human?" The questions hit harder than Clay expected, because they echoed doubts he'd been trying not to examine too closely. What was his long-term plan? He'd been focused so intently on day-to-day survival that he hadn't fully considered the larger implications of what he was doing. "I'll figure it out," he said. The same response he'd given Sheriff Rawlings. "With what resources? What expertise?" "Clay, I'm not criticizing what you've done here. These cubs would have died without your intervention, but caring for them properly requires more than good intentions and goat milk." Sarah moved back to her equipment bag and began removing items that Clay didn't recognize. Electronic devices, measuring tools, what appeared to be radio tracking equipment. The scientific apparatus seemed alien in his simple cabin, a reminder of the gulf between his intuitive approach and the professional expertise Sarah represented. "This is a GPS collar," Sarah explained, holding up a device that looked far too large for the cubs. "Modified for smaller animals. It would allow us to track the mother's movements, understand her territorial range, assess the viability of eventual release in this area." "You want to put that thing on her?" "If we can safely tranquilize her, yes. The data would be invaluable for understanding her behavior and planning for the cub's future." Clay studied the collar, imagining it around the neck of the proud creature who'd trusted him with her most precious possessions. The idea of tranquilizing her, of reducing her to a scientific subject, felt like a betrayal of that trust. "She came to me for help," he said quietly. "Not to be studied. She came to you because she was desperate and you were the only option available. That doesn't mean your approach is the best long-term solution for her or her cubs." The sound of vehicles approaching ended their conversation. Through the window, Clay could see 2 official trucks making their way up his road. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, just as Sarah had predicted. "What happens now?" Clay asked. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying the cubs, who had resumed their feeding demands with increasing volume. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Protocol says the cubs should be relocated to a wildlife rehabilitation facility immediately. The mother should be tranquilized and relocated to prevent future human-wildlife conflicts. And you think that's the right thing to do?" Sarah looked at him with eyes that reminded him painfully of Tom. Serious, thoughtful, struggling with competing loyalties. "A week ago, I would have said yes, without hesitation. But what I'm seeing here challenges some assumptions about wildlife behavior and human intervention." She paused, watching Little Bear attempt another escape from the enclosure. "These cubs are healthier than they should be. The mother's continued presence suggests a level of trust that's unprecedented in my experience. And your setup, while unconventional, is actually providing excellent care." The official vehicles were in the yard now, their doors slamming as uniformed personnel prepared for what they clearly expected to be a routine wildlife removal operation. "I need to ask you something," Sarah said quickly. "Are you willing to work with me? To consider options that might allow the cubs to stay here while we develop a proper long-term plan?" Clay looked at her, this grown woman who carried his brother's eyes and his own stubborn streak. 15 years ago, he'd let grief and guilt drive away the last connection to his family. Now faced with losing the cubs that had brought purpose back to his life, he found himself willing to trust someone again. What kind of options? "I don't know yet. But give me a chance to find out." Outside, official voices were calling his name. Clay looked at the cubs, now climbing over each other in their eagerness to reach the feeding bottles. He thought about the mother lion watching from the trees, about the trust she'd placed in him, about the second chance he'd been given to protect something precious. "All right," he said. "But the cubs stay healthy and the mother stays free. Those are my conditions." Sarah nodded, hefting her equipment bag as she prepared to meet her colleagues. "Those are mine too." For the first time in 15 years, Clay felt like he had family on his side. The meeting with Colorado Parks and Wildlife lasted 3 hours, during which Clay watched Sarah transform from his uncertain great-niece into a formidable advocate for an unprecedented approach to wildlife management. She presented her case with the calm authority of someone who'd spent years in the field, using scientific language and protocol references that Clay barely understood but deeply appreciated. The officials, Two wildlife officers and a veterinarian had arrived expecting a straightforward removal operation. What they found was a situation that challenged every standard procedure in their manual. The cubs were thriving under Clay's care. The mother was exhibiting behavior that contradicted decades of research on mountain lion psychology, and Sarah was proposing a monitored rehabilitation program that had never been attempted in Colorado. The cubs' survival rate in this environment is demonstrably higher than what we could expect in a traditional rehabilitation facility, Sarah argued, her laptop displaying charts and graphs that somehow made Clay's improvised nursery look like a scientific endeavor. The mother's continued presence suggests optimal conditions for eventual reintegration into wild behavior patterns. Dr. Amanda Foster, the state veterinarian, examined each cub with the thoroughness of someone whose job depended on accurate assessment. Her initial skepticism gave way to grudging admiration as she noted their weight gain, muscle development, and alert responsiveness. "They're in excellent condition," she admitted. "Better than I'd expect from cubs this age in most rehabilitation facilities." The discussion continued through the morning, with Sarah proposing a formal monitoring program that would allow the cubs to remain with Clay under state supervision. She volunteered to conduct weekly assessments, maintain detailed records, and coordinate with university researchers who might benefit from studying this unique situation. In the end, bureaucratic caution proved less powerful than scientific curiosity. The officials agreed to a provisional arrangement. Clay could continue caring for the cubs for 30 days, while Sarah developed a comprehensive study proposal. If the cubs continued to thrive and showed appropriate development toward wild behavior, the arrangement might be extended, but to Officer Martinez, no relation to Sarah, despite sharing a surname, made clear any sign that the animals are becoming too habituated to humans, any safety concerns, or any deviation from the monitoring protocol, and they get relocated immediately. Clay agreed to the terms, though he barely understood half of them. What mattered was that the cubs could stay, at least for now. After the officials left, Sarah remained behind to begin implementing the monitoring protocol. The first priority was expanding the cubs' living space to accommodate their rapid growth and increasing activity levels. They need room to play, to practice hunting behaviors, to interact with each other in ways that develop natural social patterns, Sarah explained as they surveyed Clay's property for suitable construction sites. How much room? Ideally, about a quarter-acre enclosed area with varying terrain, trees for climbing, rocks for exploration, and sections that can be modified as they grow. Clay looked at his 20-acre property, then at the small cabin that had seemed perfectly adequate for a solitary man and his goats. The transformation that the cubs represented was becoming more concrete by the hour. "I've got the space," he said. "Question is materials and know-how. I can help with the design specifications. As for materials and construction..." Sarah paused, studying Clay's weathered hands and the careful craftsmanship evident in his cabin's construction. "You built this place yourself?" "Most of it. Learned carpentry from my father. Improved on it through trial and error. Then we can build what they need." The next morning brought the beginning of the most intensive construction project Clay had undertaken since building his cabin. Sarah arrived with architectural plans she'd sketched the night before, detailed drawings that transformed her scientific understanding of mountain lion behavior into practical construction requirements. They began with a wooden framework, using lumber that Clay had been seasoning for future repairs to his cabin. The design called for a multi-level enclosure that would grow with the cubs, a secure inner area for sleeping and feeding, connected to a larger exercise space, with provisions for expanding into an even larger area as the cubs matured. Working together revealed similarities between them that went beyond shared genetics. Both approached problems methodically, thinking through each step before acting. Both valued quality over speed, taking time to ensure that joints were properly fitted and foundations were solid. and both had inherited their grandfather's habit of talking through complex tasks, thinking aloud as they worked. "Tom used to do that," Sarah said on the second day, as Clay narrated his way through cutting compound angles for the enclosure's corner posts. "Mom said he could never work in silence, always had to explain what he was doing, even when no one was listening." It was the first time either of them had mentioned Tom since Sarah's arrival, and Clay felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied any reference to his brother. "He was a talker," Clay agreed. "Drove me crazy when we were kids, the way he'd chatter non-stop during hunting or fishing trips." "You took him hunting?" Clay's hand stilled on the saw handle. "Once, last time as it turned out." Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying his face. "Mom never told me much about the accident. Just that it was a hunting accident and that you blamed yourself because it was my fault, was it?" The simple question hung in the air between them, while Clay struggled with memories he'd spent 30 years trying to bury. The official report had called it an accidental discharge, a tragic but not uncommon hunting mishap. Only Clay knew the full truth, that he'd been the one holding the rifle, the one who'd turned at the wrong moment, the one whose finger had been on the trigger. "I was the one shooting," he said finally. "Tom was just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Sarah set down her own tools and moved to sit on the foundation they'd been building. "Tell me what happened." Really happened, not the official version. So Clay told her, describing that October morning in detail he'd never shared with anyone. The elk track they'd been following, the sound in the underbrush, the split-second decision to swing around with the rifle ready. Tom stepping into the line of fire just as Clay's finger found the trigger. "He lived long enough to get to the hospital," Clay concluded. "Long enough to tell me it wasn't my fault. But he was wrong." Sarah was quiet for a long time after he finished, watching the cubs through the cabin window. They'd grown bold enough to escape their cardboard enclosure regularly now, requiring the reinforced wooden pen that was nearly complete. "You know," she said finally, "Dad always wondered why you disappeared after the funeral. Mom wanted to keep in touch, wanted you to be part of my life. But you just vanished. Seemed like the right thing to do. You had a good family, a father who loved you. Didn't need a reminder of the man who killed your real father. Except you didn't kill him. You had an accident. Same result, not the same thing." Sarah picked up a wood shaving from the construction debris, turning it over in her fingers. "Dad used to say that intent matters. That the difference between accident and malice is the difference between tragedy and evil." Clay had heard similar words from well-meaning friends and family in the weeks after Tom's death, but they'd never penetrated the guilt that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. Hearing them from Tom's daughter, spoken with the authority of someone who'd grown up without a father because of Clay's mistake, somehow carried more weight. "Maybe," he said. "But it doesn't bring him back." "No, it doesn't. But it might explain why a mountain lion trusted you with her babies." Clay looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "You've spent 30 years punishing yourself for taking a life, even accidentally." Maybe she sensed someone who understood the value of protecting life. Before Clay could respond, the cubs began their familiar chorus from inside the cabin. Feeding time had become a carefully orchestrated event, now that there were 3 healthy, hungry mouths demanding attention. "Come on," Sarah said, standing and brushing sawdust from her clothes. "Let's feed your babies and finish this enclosure. They're going to need the space soon." Inside, the cubs greeted them with the enthusiastic vocalizations of animals that had learned to associate human voices with food and attention. But there was something different about their behavior. More energy, more playfulness, more of the natural curiosity that marked healthy wild animals. Little Bear had learned to climb, using his tiny claws to scale the sides of their pen with determination that would have been impressive in a creature 10 times his size. Spot had developed an obsession with pouncing, launching himself at anything that moved, including his brother's tails and Clay's bootlaces. Tiny remained the most cautious, but had begun to explore beyond the immediate safety of the pen, venturing into the cabin's corners to investigate new smells and textures. "They're developing normally," Sarah observed. making notes in the logbook she'd established to document their progress. Play behavior, curiosity, appropriate bonding with littermates. All good signs for eventual reintegration. But as they worked together to feed the cubs, Clay noticed something else: fresh meat scraps near the window that faced the tree line. Small pieces of what appeared to be rabbit and squirrel, arranged in a neat pile just outside the glass. "Sarah," he said quietly. Pointing toward the offering, she followed his gaze and smiled, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. She's still hunting for them. Still providing, even though they're getting formula? Maternal instinct doesn't recognize artificial feeding schedules. She knows her babies are here, so she brings them what she can. Clay stared at the meat scraps, evidence of the mother lion's continued devotion to cubs she could no longer directly nurse. For 2 weeks, she'd been hunting not just for herself, but for babies she couldn't touch, trusting that the strange human in the wooden den would somehow deliver her offerings to the right mouths. "We should take it to them," he said. "Actually, yes. They're old enough to begin processing small amounts of solid food. It's time to start the transition away from pure milk diet." As Sarah prepared tiny portions of the fresh meat for the cubs, Clay found himself thinking about trust and responsibility, about the weight of caring for something precious that had been freely given. The mother lion hunted for cubs she couldn't hold. He fed cubs that would someday leave him. Sarah was helping rebuild a family connection that had been broken by grief and guilt. Outside, the wooden enclosure they were building together represented more than just a housing solution for growing mountain lions. It was a symbol of collaboration, of trust rebuilt, of two people working toward a future neither of them could fully envision. The cubs accepted their first taste of solid food with the enthusiasm of natural carnivores, tiny teeth working at the meat scraps while their purrs filled the cabin. Through the window, Clay could see the mother lion watching from her pine trees, golden eyes fixed on the cabin where her children were learning to be wild again. "We're going to need that bigger enclosure finished soon," Sarah said, watching Spot attempt to climb his brother's back in pursuit of a particularly interesting meat scrap. 2 more days, Clay promised. "Maybe 3, and then we start the next phase, outdoor time, weather permitting, supervised interaction with natural environment," Clay nodded, understanding that each phase brought the cubs closer to the independence that was both the goal and the end of their relationship. But for now, they were still small enough to hold, still dependent enough to need him, still young enough that he could pretend this arrangement might last forever. Outside, snow began to fall again, and the mother lion settled deeper into her watching position among the pines. Winter was coming, and with it the real test of whether wild animals raised by humans could learn to survive in the world that had nearly claimed them as newborns. The discovery came by accident. As most life-changing revelations do, Sarah was measuring the cabin's interior dimensions for the monitoring report she'd need to submit to the state, when she noticed that the floorboards beneath Clay's kitchen table didn't quite match the rest of the room. Where the other boards ran north to south, these ran east to west, and their weathering was different, lighter, as if they'd been protected from decades of foot traffic. "Clay," she called from where she knelt with her tape measure. "Was there work done on this floor?" Clay looked up from where he was feeding Tiny, the most demanding of the cubs when it came to meal times. "Yeah, I had to replace some boards about 10 years ago. Water damage from a roof leak. Did you save anything that was stored underneath?" "Just some of my father's old things. Tools, mostly. Some papers." Clay's expression grew guarded. "Why?" Sarah had found the edge of what appeared to be a removable section, boards that had been carefully fitted but not nailed down permanently. "I think there might be storage space under here. For the monitoring report, I need to document all potential safety hazards, including anything that might attract the cubs' curiosity." Clay set down the feeding bottle and crossed to where Sarah worked. Together, they lifted the section of flooring to reveal a shallow space that had been used as an improvised root cellar or storm shelter by previous occupants. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and plastic, were several boxes that Clay recognized as his father's belongings. I forgot these were here, Clay admitted, lifting out a wooden crate that bore his father's initials. Haven't looked through this stuff in years. But Sarah's attention was caught by something else, a smaller box, wrapped more carefully than the others, with Tom written in faded ink on the side. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it from the cache. This was his. Clay's face went pale. I packed up his apartment after the funeral. Some things I couldn't bear to look at, so I just stored them away. Sarah set the box on the kitchen table with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. The cardboard had yellowed with age, but the contents were still protected by the plastic wrapping Clay had used 30 years ago. Inside, she found the small treasures of a young man's life: photographs, letters, a few books, and a leather journal that she recognized as the type Tom had always carried. He kept a journal? Sarah asked, her voice soft with the wonder of discovering an unknown piece of her father's life. Always. Started when he was maybe 12, kept it up through college. I never read them, figured they were private. Sarah opened the journal carefully, pages crackling with age. Tom's handwriting filled the pages, the careful script of someone who'd taken pride in penmanship. The entries were dated, running from the spring before his death through the final entry, written the morning of the hunting trip. Would you mind if I... Sarah began. Go ahead, Clay said, though his voice carried the tension of someone bracing for pain. Maybe it's time. Sarah read silently, moving through entries that painted a picture of a young man excited about life, proud of his older brother, eager to prove himself as an adult. The entries from the weeks before the hunting trip were particularly detailed, full of Tom's anticipation for what he saw as a rite of passage. Then Sarah's expression changed, and she read one entry aloud. Clay doesn't really want to take me hunting. I can tell he's only doing it because I keep asking. He's never been much for killing animals, too soft-hearted, even though he'd never admit it. But I want to do this with him, want to show him I'm not a kid anymore. Clay listened with growing discomfort as his brother's words revealed insights he'd never suspected Tom possessed. Sarah continued reading, her voice growing more intent as she reached the final entries. October 15th, talked to Jake Morrison about hunting safety today. He told me about watching your partner's position at all times, about how most accidents happen when hunters lose track of each other. Made me think about Clay. He gets focused when he's tracking, sometimes doesn't notice what's around him. I'll need to watch out for both of us. The words hit Clay like physical blows. Tom had been thinking about safety, about watching out for his older brother. Not the other way around. Sarah's voice became barely a whisper as she read the final entry. October 16th. This is it, our big hunting trip. Clay's been nervous about it all week. Keeps checking and rechecking the rifles, going over safety rules. I think he's more worried about me than about the elk. But I've been practicing with Dad's rifle, and Jake taught me about positioning and sight lines. I know what to watch for. If something goes wrong, I'll make sure Clay stays safe. That's what partners do for each other. The journal fell silent, but Sarah continued turning pages until she found what Clay realized must be the final entry. Written in pencil and barely legible. Heard the elk. Clay's moving up ahead. Something's wrong. He's not watching his angles. If he swings around now. I have to. The entry ended there, pencil marks trailing off as if Tom had dropped the journal mid-sentence. Clay stared at the page, his mind struggling to process what he was reading. For 30 years, he'd carried the weight of Tom's death, believing that his carelessness had killed his brother. But these words painted a different picture entirely, of a young man who'd been watching out for his older brother, who'd seen danger and moved to prevent it. Clay, Sarah said gently, her own voice thick with emotion. What exactly do you remember about the moment of the accident? Clay closed his eyes, forcing himself back to that October morning he'd relived countless times. I was tracking the elk, moving along the ridge. I heard something in the brush to my left, turned with the rifle ready. Tom was there, right in my line of fire. Where exactly was he? Between me and the brush, where the sound came from. Clay's eyes snapped open as the implications of that positioning became clear. He was between me and whatever I was aiming at. Sarah nodded, her understanding evident in her expression. He stepped into your line of fire, Clay, but not accidentally. The truth hit Clay with devastating clarity. Tom hadn't stumbled into danger. He deliberately placed himself between Clay and a perceived threat. In this split second when Clay had swung around to face the sound in the brush, Tom had seen his brother about to fire at what might have been another hunter, a hiker, or simply shadows that looked dangerous in the dim forest light. Tom had taken the bullet meant for someone else. "He was protecting me," Clay whispered, the words feeling foreign in his mouth after 30 years of self-blame. "He was protecting you," Sarah confirmed. "The journal makes it clear. He'd been thinking about safety, about watching out for you, about being a good hunting partner. When he saw you about to fire at something that might not have been game, he did what he thought was right." Clay sank into his chair, the weight of this revelation threatening to crush him. For 3 decades, he'd built his entire life around the belief that his carelessness had killed the person he was supposed to protect. He'd isolated himself, avoided attachments, punished himself with solitude because he believed he deserved nothing better. But Tom had died protecting him, not because of him. The emotional walls Clay had built around his heart began to crumble. 30 years of suppressed grief pouring out in great, gasping sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. He wept for his brother, for the years of unnecessary guilt, for the family connections he'd severed, for the life he'd wasted in self-imposed exile. Sarah moved to his side, her hand resting on his shoulder as he grieved for the truth he'd never known. The cubs, sensing the emotional storm in their caretaker, fell silent in their enclosure, watching with the alert stillness of wild animals in the presence of human sorrow. "All these years," Clay managed between sobs, "all these years, I thought I'd failed him." "You didn't fail him, Clay. He chose to protect you just like you've chosen to protect these cubs." The parallel struck Clay like lightning. The mother lion outside had brought her dying babies to the only source of help she knew, trusting a potential predator because her cub's survival mattered more than her own safety. Tom had stepped into the path of Clay's rifle because protecting his brother mattered more than his own life, and Clay himself had accepted responsibility for 3 wild predators because their need for protection outweighed every rational consideration of safety or practicality. "She knows," Clay said suddenly, looking toward the window where the mother lion maintained her vigil. "She knows what it means to protect something more important than yourself." Sarah followed his gaze to the golden form among the pine trees. "I think she recognized something in you. Maybe the same protective instinct that made Tom step in front of that rifle." Clay wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, feeling lighter than he had in decades, despite the emotional exhaustion. The guilt that had defined his adult life was gone, replaced by a profound understanding of his brother's final act of love. "What do I do with this?" he asked Sarah. "How do I live with knowing he died, saving me?" "The same way you've been living with the cubs," Sarah said gently. "By honoring the protection you were given, by using the life he saved to save others." Outside, the mother lion rose from her resting place and padded closer to the cabin, as if sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the emotional landscape of her cub's sanctuary. She settled into a new position, closer than she'd ever come before, her golden eyes fixed on the windows with an expression that seemed almost understanding. Little Bear chose that moment to achieve his most ambitious escape yet, climbing out of the wooden enclosure and padding across the floor to where Clay sat. The cub's tiny paws pressed against Clay's leg as he climbed into his lap, and purring with the contentment of a creature that knew it was safe. "Thank you," Clay whispered to the journal, to Tom's memory, to the brother who'd given his life so that Clay could have the chance to save others. For the first time in 30 years, Clay Dawson felt worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. Tom's trust, the mother lion's trust, and now these small lives that depended on him for everything. The truth had set him free, but more than that, it had shown him the path forward. He wasn't the man who'd killed his brother. He was the man his brother had died to save. And that man had work to do. The cubs needed him. The mother lion was counting on him. And somewhere in the mountains, other wild creatures might need the kind of protection that only someone who understood the value of sacrifice could provide. Clay looked at Sarah, seeing his brother's eyes, looking back at him with approval and love. "We need to finish that enclosure," he said, "and start planning for the next phase." The next phase. Clay gestured toward the window, where the mother lion watched over her children with the patience of someone who'd found the right person for the job. Building something bigger, something permanent, a place where wild things can be safe while they learn to be wild again. Sarah smiled, and in that expression, Clay saw not just his great niece, but his partner in a mission that Tom would have understood and approved of. They were going to build something lasting, something worthy of the trust that wild mothers and dying brothers placed in those they chose to protect. The journal lay open on the table, its secrets finally revealed, its burden finally shared. Tom's words would never bring him back, but they had given Clay something even more precious, the knowledge that love sometimes looked like sacrifice, and sacrifice sometimes looked like salvation. And in the quiet of his mountain cabin, surrounded by cubs that trusted him and watched by a mother who'd chosen him, Clay finally understood that he'd been living the life Tom had died to give him. It was time to make that life count. The official letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a state vehicle that Clay watched, winding up his mountain road with the grim certainty of approaching fate. He'd been expecting this moment since the 30-day provisional period began, but the sight of the familiar parks and wildlife truck still sent a spike of anxiety through his chest. Dr. Foster, an officer. Martinez climbed out of the vehicle with the purposeful movements of people carrying unwelcome news. Behind them, Clay could see a second vehicle following up the road, a larger truck that looked ominously like a transport vehicle. "Morning, Clay," Dr. Foster said, her professional demeanor more formal than during previous visits. "Is Sarah here?" "Inside with the cubs. They're doing their morning exercise in the new enclosure." Clay had completed the expanded habitat 3 days earlier, creating a space that allowed the cubs to practice climbing, stalking, and the other behaviors they'd need as wild animals. The 3 cubs, now the size of house cats and growing rapidly, had taken to their new environment with enthusiasm that both pleased and worried Clay. Their increasing wildness was proof that Sarah's rehabilitation plan was working. But it also marked the countdown to their eventual release. "We need to speak with both of you," Officer Martinez said, holding up an official envelope that Clay recognized as the kind that contained legal documents. Sarah emerged from the cabin as if summoned, the cubs trailing behind her like furry shadows. In the 3 weeks since the truth about Tom's death had been revealed, she'd become a fixture at Clay's place, splitting her time between the mountain sanctuary and her university responsibilities. The arrangement had worked better than either of them had expected, creating a partnership that honored both scientific rigor and intuitive care. "Official news?" Sarah asked, noting the formal atmosphere. Dr. Foster opened the envelope and withdrew a thick document bearing multiple official seals. "The review board has made their decision regarding the mountain lion cubs currently under your care. After consideration of all factors, including Dr. Martinez's comprehensive reports and the cubs' demonstrated health and development, the board has concluded that continued private rehabilitation poses unacceptable risks to both public safety and the animals' long-term welfare." Clay felt the words hit him like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means the cubs are to be relocated to an accredited wildlife facility within 7 days, Officer Martinez said. "The Denver Zoo has agreed to take them into their large carnivore program, where they'll receive professional care until they're mature enough for potential release in a more suitable habitat." "The Denver Zoo," Sarah repeated, her voice carefully controlled. "That's a captive facility, not a rehabilitation program. It's an accredited facility with expertise in large carnivore care," Dr. Foster corrected. The cubs will receive excellent medical attention, proper nutrition, and socialization with other mountain lions. They'll receive captivity, Clay said quietly. Bars and concrete and crowds of tourists taking pictures. They'll receive professional care that ensures their survival, Officer Martinez countered. Mr. Dawson, with all due respect, you're not a trained wildlife rehabilitator. You don't have the resources or expertise to prepare these animals for eventual release. Sarah stepped forward, her scientific credentials lending weight to her words. Actually, the cubs' development under Clay's care has exceeded every benchmark for successful rehabilitation. They're demonstrating appropriate wild behaviors, maintaining healthy social bonds with their littermates, and showing no signs of problematic habituation to humans. That's noted in your reports, Dr. Martinez, and it's commendable. But it doesn't address the fundamental issue of long-term safety and legal liability. Clay studied the transport vehicle that had finally made its way up the mountain road. Large, secure, designed for moving dangerous animals from one controlled environment to another. The sight of it made his stomach turn. "What about the mother?" he asked. "She'll be tranquilized and relocated to a remote area of the national forest, far enough from human habitation to prevent future conflicts." "You mean far enough from her cubs to ensure she never sees them again?" Dr. Foster's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Dawson, I understand this is difficult. You've formed an attachment to these animals, and your care has been exceptional. But we have to consider what's best for the species, not just these individual animals." The mother lion emerged from the tree line as if summoned by the conversation. Over the past month, she'd grown increasingly bold, sometimes approaching within 10 feet of the cabin during feeding times. Now she took up a position between the official vehicles and the cabin, her body language unmistakably protective. "She knows," Clay said, watching the lion's careful assessment of the strangers in her territory. "She knows you're here to take her babies. Mountain lions don't have that level of cognitive understanding," Dr. Foster said. But her voice lacked conviction as she watched the lion's deliberate positioning. "Don't they?" Sarah asked. "Because her behavior for the past month has challenged every assumption about mountain lion maternal psychology. She's demonstrated planning, problem-solving, and trust behaviors that aren't documented in any literature." Officer Martinez was already reaching for the radio on his belt. "We're going to need the tranquilizer equipment," he said. "The mother's too close for safe cub removal." "Wait," Clay said, raising his hand. "Give me a minute to secure the cubs first. No need to traumatize them any more than necessary." Dr. Foster nodded. 5 minutes. "Then we proceed with the relocation." Clay walked toward the cabin, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to the same inevitable conclusion. In 7 days, the cubs would be caged in a zoo. Their mother would be alone in some distant forest, and his mountain sanctuary would return to the empty silence he'd maintained for 30 years. But this time, the silence would be different. This time, it would be haunted by the knowledge of what he'd lost through his own failure to fight for what mattered. Inside the cabin, the cubs greeted him with their usual enthusiasm, climbing up his legs and purring with the contentment of creatures that knew they were safe and loved. Little Bear, now bold enough to explore every corner of the cabin, rubbed against Clay's hand with the trust of someone who'd never known betrayal. Spot practiced his pouncing technique on Clay's bootlaces, while Tiny watched from a safe distance with the intelligent wariness that would serve him well in the wild. "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked quietly, kneeling beside the cubs. Clay looked at her. This young woman who'd brought scientific credibility to his intuitive approach, who'd helped him understand the truth about Tom's death, who'd become the family he'd thought he'd lost forever. In her eyes, he saw the same desperate determination he felt in his own chest. "We're going to fight," he said. "Clay, they have legal authority. We can't just refuse to comply, can't we?" Sarah studied his face, reading the resolution there. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about what Tom would do. What he did do when he saw something that was wrong and had the chance to make it right." Clay gathered the cubs into their travel carrier, the same one he'd used to take them to the veterinarian for their health checks. They protested briefly, but settled when they realized they were still together. "The cubs stay," Clay announced as he carried them outside. "The mother stays. If that means I have to face the consequences, so be it." Officer Martinez was already unpacking tranquilizer equipment from the transport vehicle. "Mr. Dawson, you need to understand that interfering with a legal wildlife relocation is a federal offense. I understand that you're about to destroy a family that trusted me to protect them. We're following established protocol for dangerous wildlife." "Management? Dangerous?" Clay gestured toward the cubs, who were peering through the carrier's mesh with bright, curious eyes. "These babies are dangerous? They will be when they're adults, especially if they've been habituated to human contact." Sarah stepped up beside Clay, her decision made. "They haven't been habituated. My reports document appropriate fear responses to unfamiliar humans, natural hunting instincts, and normal social development. These cubs are excellent candidates for successful release. In a controlled environment, under professional supervision," Dr. Foster said. "In their natural habitat, with their mother, under the supervision of qualified wildlife biologists," Sarah countered. "Which is exactly what we're providing here." The standoff stretched for several moments, broken only by the soft sounds of the cubs and the mother lion's low vocalization from her watching position. Clay felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him: comply with authority and lose everything that mattered, or resist and face the legal consequences of protecting what he loved. Then he thought about Tom's final entry in his journal: "If something goes wrong, I'll make sure Clay stays safe." That's what partners do for each other. Tom had risked everything to protect his brother. Clay could do no less for the creatures that had trusted him with their lives. "They're not going," Clay said, his voice carrying the quiet finality of someone who'd made an irrevocable choice. "The cubs stay here, the mother stays free, and if you want to change that, you'll have to go through me." Officer Martinez's hand moved toward his sidearm, not in threat, but in the automatic gesture of someone preparing for conflict. "Mr. Dawson, I'm going to ask you one more time to comply with the relocation order, and I'm going to tell you one more time, no." The mother lion rose from her position and padded closer, now less than 20 feet from the group of humans. Her attention was fixed on the cubs in their carrier, and her low vocalizations had taken on an urgency that needed no translation. "She's getting agitated," Dr. Foster warned. "We need to proceed with tranquilization before this situation becomes dangerous." "The only dangerous thing here is what you're planning to do to her family," Clay said. Sarah moved to stand beside him, presenting a united front against the official authority arrayed before them. "I'm withdrawing my cooperation with the relocation," she announced. "As the consulting biologist on this case, I'm documenting my professional opinion that removal would be detrimental to the cubs' development and contrary to their best interests." "Dr. Martinez, you're jeopardizing your professional standing," Dr. Foster warned. "I'm standing by my research and my principles." The sound of additional vehicles approaching drew everyone's attention. Clay expected to see backup law enforcement, but instead found himself watching a convoy of pickup trucks making their way up his mountain road. As they drew closer, he recognized faces from Silverbrook, Mike Patterson from the feed store, Jimmy Reeves, the hunting guide, even Mrs. Henderson from the post office. "Looks like word got out," Sarah murmured. The trucks parked in a rough semicircle around the official vehicles, and their occupants emerged with the purposeful movements of people who'd come to take a stand. Clay counted at least 20 townspeople, including several he barely knew, but who'd apparently decided that his fight was worth supporting. "Morning, Clay," Mike Patterson called out. "Heard you might need some witnesses today." "Witnesses to what?" Officer Martinez asked. "To whether a man has the right to protect animals that asked for his help," Jimmy Reeves said. "Far as I can see, those cubs are healthy and happy, and their mama trusts Clay enough to stick around. That's more than most wildlife facilities can claim." Dr. Foster looked around at the assembled crowd, clearly recognizing that the situation had moved beyond simple wildlife management into something more complex. "This doesn't change the legal requirements," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier certainty. Maybe not, said a new voice from the back of the crowd. But it changes the political reality. Clay turned to see Mayor Janet Collins emerging from one of the trucks, followed by a man he didn't recognize carrying what appeared to be camera equipment. "Mr. Dawson," the mayor said, "I'd like you to meet Tom Bradley from Channel 7 News. He's been following your story, and he'd like to ask you a few questions about what's happening here today." Clay looked at the reporter, then at Sarah, then at the official documents that would take the Cubs away from everything they'd ever known as safe. The choice was clear: submit to authority and lose his family, or make a public stand and face whatever consequences followed. He set the Cubs carrier down on the porch and looked directly into the news camera. "My name is Clay Dawson," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "6 weeks ago, a wild mountain lion brought her dying cubs to my door, asking for help. Today, the state wants to take those healthy, happy babies away from their mother and lock them in a zoo for the rest of their lives." The camera rolled, recording his words and the scene around him. The mother lion watching protectively from the tree line, the cubs peering curiously from their carrier. The community that had come to support a cause they believed in. "The question isn't whether I have the legal right to keep these cubs," Clay continued. "The question is whether we have the moral obligation to protect families that trust us, even when it's difficult, even when it challenges the rules we've made for ourselves." The mother lion vocalized again, a sound that seemed to echo Clay's words across the mountain valley. The cubs responded from their carrier, their small voices joining their mother's call in a conversation that transcended species. And in that moment, Clay understood that the fight for his mountain lions was bigger than bureaucratic compliance or personal attachment. It was about the kind of world they wanted to create, one where trust was honored, families were protected, and love was allowed to transcend the boundaries between wild and tame. The official relocation papers fluttered in the mountain breeze, but Clay no longer cared what they said. He'd made his choice, the same choice Tom had made 30 years ago. He was going to protect what mattered, whatever the cost. The news camera continued rolling as Dr. Foster made a decision that would transform a local wildlife dispute into something much larger. She nodded to the technician operating the tranquilizer equipment, a gesture that sent ripples of tension through the crowd of supporters who'd gathered in Clay's yard. "We're proceeding with the relocation," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "For public safety and the welfare of the animals." The mother lion's response was immediate and unmistakable. She rose from her position near the tree line and padded forward with fluid grace, placing herself directly between the officials and the cabin where her cubs waited. Her golden eyes fixed on the tranquilizer equipment with the intelligent assessment of a creature that had encountered such devices before. "Easy, girl," Clay said softly, recognizing the shift in the lion's demeanor. Where she'd been merely watchful before, now she was actively protective, her powerful body coiled with the potential for explosive action. "Everyone needs to step back," Officer Martinez ordered, his own hand moving to his sidearm. "This animal is displaying aggressive behavior." "She's displaying maternal behavior," Sarah corrected, but she too was moving slowly, recognizing the volatility of the situation. "She's protecting her cubs." The tranquilizer technician raised his rifle, a specialized weapon designed to deliver sedative darts with precision accuracy. The mother lion's attention focused on the device with laser intensity, and Clay realized she was calculating distances, timing, the mathematics of survival that had kept her alive in the wild. "Wait," Sarah said suddenly, her binoculars focused on the lion's neck. "Something's wrong here." "What do you mean wrong?" Dr. Foster demanded. "She's wearing a collar." "A research collar." Sarah adjusted the focus, studying the device barely visible beneath the lion's thick fur. "I can see the antenna." Dr. Foster grabbed her own binoculars, scanning the lion's neck region until she found what Sarah had spotted. "Jesus Christ," she breathed. "That's a GPS tracking collar, which means she's been studied before," Officer Martinez said. should have records of her in the database. More than that, Sarah said grimly. It means she's had contact with wildlife researchers before. She knows what tranquilizer equipment looks like. The implications hit Clay like a physical blow. The mother lion's unusual behavior, seeking human help, trusting him with her cubs, wasn't unprecedented maternal instinct. It was learned behavior from previous encounters with wildlife management. Dr. Foster was already on her radio, requesting data on collared mountain lions in the region. The response came quickly, crackling through the static with information that changed everything they thought they knew about the situation. Collar number F47, the voice reported. Adult female, approximately 7 years old. Originally collared as part of the San Juan Range study in 2018. Lost 3 previous litters to various causes: predation, disease, human interference. Last known position was 30 miles northwest of current location. 3 previous litters, Clay repeated, understanding flooding through him. She's lost 3 sets of cubs, and she traveled 30 miles to bring these ones to you, Sarah added, the full significance of the mother lion's choice becoming clear. She didn't come here by accident, Clay. She chose you specifically. The mother lion seemed to sense that she was the subject of their discussion. She lifted her head higher, and for the first time, Clay could clearly see the collar Sarah had spotted, a sophisticated piece of technology that had been monitoring this lion's movements, documenting her territory, her hunting patterns, her failed attempts at raising cubs to maturity. What happened to her other litters? Clay asked. Dr. Foster consulted her tablet, scrolling through data that painted a picture of tragedy and loss. First litter in 2019, killed by a male lion establishing territory. Second litter in 2021, died from disease during a harsh winter. Third litter in 2022, relocated by wildlife officials after they were found denning too close to human habitation. Relocated where? Wildlife Rehabilitation Facility. They didn't survive the transition. The words hung heavy in the mountain air, explaining the mother lion's desperate choice to seek human help. She'd learned through bitter experience that the natural world could be as deadly to her cubs as human interference. But she'd also learned that not all humans were the same. Clay looked at the magnificent creature who'd entrusted him with her most precious possessions, understanding now that her choice hadn't been random desperation. She'd known exactly what she was doing when she brought her dying cubs to his door. She researched me, he said wonderfully. Somehow, she knew I was different. Mountain lions don't research humans, Dr. Foster protested, but her voice lacked conviction. This one did, Sarah said firmly. Look at her behavior patterns. She didn't just stumble across Clay's cabin, she sought it out. She's been in this valley for weeks, probably observing, learning, determining whether he could be trusted. The technician with the tranquilizer rifle was growing impatient. We need to make a decision here. Every minute we wait increases the danger to everyone present. But Clay was studying the mother lion with new understanding, seeing her not as a wild animal driven by instinct, but as a mother who'd made calculated decisions based on hard-won experience. She'd chosen him over the wilderness, over wildlife facilities, over every other option available to her. She's not dangerous, Clay said quietly. She's desperate. To prove his point, Clay walked slowly toward the mother lion, ignoring the sharp warnings from the officials behind him. The lion watched his approach with alert caution, but didn't retreat. When he was close enough to touch her, Clay extended his hand, palm up, the same gesture he'd used with her cubs. The mother lion sniffed his hand carefully, her warm breath tickling his palm. Then, in a gesture that sent gasps through the watching crowd, she touched her nose to his fingers, the greeting of recognition between partners who'd shared the work of protecting something precious. Remarkable, Dr. Foster breathed, lowering her tranquilizer rifle. I've never seen anything like this. Because you've never seen a mother lion who's lost everything she loved to the very system you represent, Sarah said. She's not trusting Clay despite his humanity. She's trusting him because of it. The cubs, sensing their mother's proximity, began calling from their carrier. The mother lion's response was immediate, a soft, reassuring vocalization that needed no translation. Clay could hear the conversation between mother and children, a dialogue of comfort and promise that transcended species. The collar data, Clay said, an idea forming in his mind. Does it show where she's been hunting? What she's been doing to survive while her cubs were with me? Dr. Foster consulted her tablet again. She's been ranging over nearly 100 square miles, hunting successfully, maintaining excellent physical condition. Far more active than we'd expect for a lactating female. Because she wasn't lactating, Sarah realized. She was hunting for cubs she couldn't nurse, bringing food for babies she couldn't hold. The GPS data probably shows her returning to this area regularly. Every day, Dr. Foster confirmed, scrolling through location points. Multiple visits daily, always returning to the same area near your cabin. Clay looked at the mother lion, seeing her story written in the scars on her coat. The wisdom in her eyes, the careful calculation in every movement. She'd survived the loss of 3 litters, learned from each tragedy, and finally found a solution that worked. A human partner who could provide what she couldn't: warmth, milk, medical care, protection from the very authorities that stood before them now. You're not taking her cubs, Clay said with quiet finality. She's already lost too much. I won't be part of another loss. The standoff crystallized around that moment. Armed officials with legal authority facing a determined man and a mother lion who'd already made her choice. The townspeople watched from their vehicles. The news camera recorded every detail, and somewhere in the wider world, people were beginning to hear about the mountain valley where a hermit and a wild lion had found common ground in protecting what they loved. The mother lion's collar beeped softly, recording GPS coordinates that would become part of her official record. But the real documentation was happening in front of them. The sight of a wild predator and a human standing together, united in their refusal to let bureaucracy destroy a family that had chosen trust over fear. Dr. Foster lowered her radio, studying the scene with the eye of someone whose scientific training was warring with the evidence before her eyes. This changes things, she admitted reluctantly. How so? Officer Martinez asked. Because we're not dealing with standard wildlife management anymore. This is something entirely new. The mother lion seemed to sense the shift in the official's demeanor. She settled into a sphinx-like position, still alert, but no longer coiled for action. Her message was clear. She would protect her cubs if necessary. But she preferred cooperation. Clay remained beside her, his hand resting lightly on her powerful shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing and the trust she'd placed in him. Together, they waited to see whether the human officials would choose wisdom or protocol, understanding or authority. The fate of a family hung in the balance, watched by a community that had already made its choice about which side of history it wanted to be on. The moment of decision stretched like a held breath until Clay stepped forward, his hand still resting on the mother lion's shoulder, and spoke with a clarity that surprised even himself. Dr. Foster, with respect to your position and your expertise, you're missing the bigger picture here. Clay's voice carried across the yard with the authority of someone who'd found his purpose. This isn't about protocol or wildlife management or even safety. This is about whether we're brave enough to recognize something unprecedented when it happens. He gestured toward the mother lion, who remained calm despite being surrounded by officials and equipment. This animal has shown more intelligence, more planning, more genuine problem-solving than most humans display in crisis situations. She researched her options, evaluated potential outcomes, and made a conscious choice to trust me with the most precious things in her world. Dr. Foster started to respond, but Clay continued, his words flowing with conviction that had been building for weeks. You talk about habituation like it's automatically harmful. But what if it's evolution? What if she's learned that some humans can be trusted partners rather than threats? What if she's teaching us something about coexistence instead of control? Clay moved toward the cub's carrier, the mother lion padding alongside him with perfect synchronization. To the watching officials, it was clear that human and lion were functioning as a coordinated team. "May I show you something?" Clay asked, not waiting for permission before opening the carrier door. The three cubs emerged with the confident curiosity of animals that had never known fear in their caretaker's presence. Little Bear immediately climbed Clay's leg to perch on his shoulder, while Spot and Tiny explored the unfamiliar crowd with alert interest, but no signs of panic. "These cubs aren't habituated," Clay said, as the mother lion approached her babies for the first time in front of human witnesses. "They're socialized. They know the difference between their family, their mother and me, and strangers." To prove his point, Clay gestured toward Officer Martinez. "Sir, would you mind taking a step toward us?" The officer moved forward cautiously. Immediately, all three cubs retreated toward their mother, clustering around her legs with the appropriate wariness of wild animals encountering potential threats. The mother lion's posture shifted subtly, protective but not aggressive. "Now watch," Clay said, stepping between the cubs and the officer. Instantly, the cubs relaxed, understanding that their human protector had assessed the situation and found it manageable. Dr. Foster was documenting the interaction with obvious fascination. "The cubs are displaying normal fear responses to unfamiliar humans, while maintaining clear bonds with both their biological mother and their human caregiver. This is absolutely unprecedented in large carnivore psychology." "Because it's not psychology," Sarah said, moving to Clay's side. "It's sociology. We're seeing the development of an interspecies family unit with complex social dynamics." Clay knelt beside the cubs, who immediately swarmed over him with the enthusiasm of children greeting a beloved parent. The mother lion settled beside the group, creating a protective circle that included Clay as an integral member. "This is what you'd be destroying," Clay said to the assembled officials. "Not just the cubs' rehabilitation, but a functional family unit that's found a way to bridge the gap between wild and human worlds." From his jacket pocket, Clay withdrew a folded piece of paper that he'd been carrying since the standoff began. "I wrote this last night," he said, offering it to Dr. Foster, "in case this moment came." Dr. Foster unfolded the handwritten letter. Reading aloud, "To whom it may concern, I, Clay Dawson, formally request designation as a licensed wildlife rehabilitation facility specializing in large carnivore orphan care. I offer my property, my resources, and my commitment to serve as an official sanctuary for animals that cannot be successfully rehabilitated through traditional methods." The letter continued. "I understand the legal requirements, insurance obligations, and inspection protocols involved in such designation. I accept full responsibility for meeting all federal and state standards for wildlife care. In exchange, I ask only for the right to continue protecting animals that have chosen to trust me." Dr. Foster looked up from the letter. "Mr. Dawson, do you understand what you're proposing? The liability involved, the ongoing oversight, the restrictions on your personal freedom?" "I understand that 30 years ago I isolated myself because I was afraid of losing someone I loved," Clay replied. "And I understand that 6 weeks ago something dying asked me for help, and helping it brought my life back to me. If protecting what I love means accepting oversight and responsibility, then that's a small price to pay." The mother lion chose that moment to demonstrate the depth of trust that had developed between them. She rose from her position and padded to the news camera, studying it with careful attention before returning to Clay's side. Her message was unmistakable. She was comfortable with documentation, with witnesses, with the kind of public scrutiny that official designation would bring. Mayor Collins stepped forward from the crowd of supporters. "Dr. Foster, I'd like to formally endorse Mr. Dawson's request on behalf of the town of Silverbrook. We've seen the results of his care, and we're prepared to support whatever official processes are required. The county's behind this too," added Jimmy Reeves. "Hell, we've got tourists coming up here just to get a glimpse of the Lion Man and his family. This could be the best thing to happen to our economy in decades." Dr. Foster looked around at the assembled crowd. The news camera. The cubs playing peacefully in the midst of what should have been a dangerous wildlife removal operation. "This is highly irregular," she said, but her tone suggested she was looking for reasons to approve rather than reject. "So was a wild lion asking a hermit for help," Clay said. "Sometimes irregular is exactly what the situation requires." Officer Martinez had been quiet throughout the exchange, but now he stepped forward with the air of someone who'd reached a decision. "Dr. Foster, I'm not seeing any immediate threat to public safety here. The animals are contained, supervised, and showing appropriate behavior. If Mr. Dawson is willing to pursue official licensing, it would require a complete facility inspection, detailed operational plans, insurance certification, and ongoing monitoring," Dr. Foster said. "The process could take months, and during that process," Sarah asked, "the cubs would remain here under provisional care, pending final approval." Clay felt something loosen in his chest, not quite relief, because the fight wasn't over, but hoped that the fight might be winnable. "And the mother?" Dr. Foster consulted her tablet again, scrolling through regulations and precedents. "If she continues to demonstrate non-aggressive behavior and remains on your property voluntarily, there's no legal basis for removal." The cubs had grown bored with the adult conversation and were now engaged in an enthusiastic wrestling match that demonstrated their healthy development and natural behaviors. Their mother watched with the patient attention of a parent supervising playtime, occasionally intervening with gentle vocalizations when the play grew too rough. "There's one more thing," Clay said, emboldened by the official's apparent willingness to consider alternatives. "I want this to be bigger than just my property. If this works, if we can demonstrate successful interspecies cooperation, I want to establish a research partnership with the university. Study what we're learning here, develop protocols that could help other situations like this." Sarah's eyes lit up with the excitement of a scientist presented with unprecedented research opportunities. A field station dedicated to human-wildlife cooperation studies. The data we could gather, the applications for other endangered species, one step at a time, Dr. Foster cautioned, but Clay could see the wheels turning in her mind. "First, we need to see if you can meet the basic requirements for wildlife facility licensing." The mother lion gathered her cubs with soft vocalizations, herding them back toward the cabin as the crowd of humans began to disperse. The crisis had passed, replaced by the complex process of turning an impossible situation into an official reality. Clay watched his family, for that's what they'd become, however unconventional, settle into their afternoon routine. The cubs would nap in their enclosure, the mother would resume her vigil from the pine trees, and he would continue the work of keeping them safe while they decided whether the world was worth trusting. It wasn't the ending he'd expected when a dying cub was placed at his feet 6 weeks ago, but it was the beginning of something larger, a recognition that love sometimes looked like radical trust, and protection sometimes required stepping into the light rather than hiding in the shadows. Clay Dawson, hermit of the San Juan Mountains, had become Clay Dawson, guardian of impossible families and advocate for creatures that bridged worlds. And for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't afraid of what came next. 6 months later, Clay stood on his expanded porch, watching Sarah adjust the camera settings for what had become a weekly ritual. The Dawson Mountain Lion Sanctuary, officially licensed and fully operational, had attracted attention from wildlife researchers, conservation groups, and documentary filmmakers from around the world. But this photograph was different. This one was for family. "Hold still, Uncle Clay," Sarah laughed, trying to frame a shot that captured both the man and the magnificent creatures that had transformed his life. "The university wants this for their annual report, but I want it for my wall." The 3 cubs, no longer cubs, but adolescent mountain lions the size of large dogs, lounged in the afternoon sun with the casual confidence of animals that had never known fear. Little Bear, now the undisputed leader of the trio, had claimed the highest spot on the rocky outcropping Clay had built for their exercise. Spot and Tiny flanked him, creating a portrait of wild grace that still took Clay's breath away. Their mother rested in her favorite spot beneath the pine trees. But she wasn't alone. Curled against her warm flank were two new cubs, barely 3 weeks old, products of a mating that had occurred in the safety of the sanctuary's expanded boundaries. The sight of her successfully raising another litter, her first to survive past infancy, represented more than just wildlife conservation success. It was proof that some wounds could heal, some trust could be rebuilt, some families could be made whole again. "Say goat milk," Sarah called out, and Clay found himself genuinely smiling for the camera, something that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months ago. The photograph captured more than just Clay and his lions. In the background, the sprawling complex that had grown from his simple cabin told the story of what happened when isolated people opened their hearts to impossible possibilities. The original cabin remained his home, but it was now connected to a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic, a research facility where Sarah spent half her time, and educational buildings where school groups learned about wildlife conservation. "Perfect," Sarah announced, reviewing the digital image. "You look like someone who's found his calling." Clay supposed he had. The official designation as a wildlife sanctuary had brought responsibilities he'd never imagined, but also rewards beyond anything he'd dared hope for. The sanctuary provided specialized care for orphaned and injured large carnivores throughout the region. But its real innovation was the research into human-wildlife cooperation that had emerged from his relationship with the mountain lions. "Dr. Martinez," called a voice from the research building. Dr. Amanda Foster, who'd become the sanctuary's consulting veterinarian after witnessing the unprecedented success of Clay's approach, emerged with a clipboard and the satisfied expression of someone delivering good news. "The health assessments came back perfect," she announced. "All 5 lions showing optimal development, excellent social bonds, and appropriate wild behaviors. The reviewers from Fish and Wildlife are recommending permanent sanctuary status." The news was gratifying, but Clay's attention was drawn to movement near the tree line. A park ranger was hiking up the trail from the main road, and with him walked an elderly woman Clay didn't recognize. "Expecting visitors?" Sarah asked, noting his focus. "Not official ones," the ranger introduced. Himself as Tom Bradley, no relation to the news reporter who'd documented their standoff 6 months earlier, and explained that his companion was Dr. Ellen Hartwell, a wildlife ethologist from Berkeley who'd specifically requested to visit the sanctuary. "I've been following your work here," Dr. Hartwell said, her keen eyes taking in the peaceful scene of humans and predators sharing space. "What you've accomplished challenges some fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between wild and domestic." Clay led the group on a tour of the facilities, explaining how each area had been designed to meet both the lions' needs and the research requirements that justified the sanctuary's existence. But the real demonstration came when he called to the adolescent lions, who responded by bounding down from their rocky perch to greet him with the enthusiasm of children welcoming a beloved parent home from work. "Remarkable," Dr. Hartwell murmured, watching Little Bear rub against Clay's legs while maintaining appropriate wariness toward the strangers. "They're showing perfect social discrimination, full bonding with familiar humans, normal predator-prey relationships with livestock, appropriate caution toward unfamiliar people." "It's not training," Sarah explained, leading them toward the research building where she documented every aspect of the lion's development. It's socialization within a complex family structure that includes both human and lion members. The research building contained evidence of the sanctuary's growing impact on wildlife management practices. Universities from 3 states had established research partnerships, and the protocols developed at the sanctuary were being tested with other species in other locations. Clay's intuitive approach to animal care had been analyzed, documented, and refined into teachable methodologies that were changing how wildlife officials approached difficult cases. But the real measure of success was simpler and more profound. The sound of healthy cubs playing in the safety of their mother's territory, secure in the knowledge that the humans who shared their world could be trusted. As the visitors departed and evening settled over the valley, Clay found himself in the familiar ritual that marked the end of each day. He walked the perimeter of the sanctuary, checking enclosures, noting the locations and behaviors of his charges, ensuring that all was well in the world he'd helped create. The mother lion and her new cubs had settled into their evening routine, the babies nursing while she maintained her eternal vigilance. The adolescents had claimed their sleeping spots on the rocky outcropping, close enough to their mother for comfort but independent enough to assert their growing maturity. Sarah emerged from the research building where she'd been updating data files for submission to the wildlife journals that now regularly published their findings. "Long day," she said, joining Clay on his evening rounds. "Good day, though." They walked in comfortable silence through the sanctuary that had become home to them both. Sarah had officially relocated from the university, establishing the first field research station dedicated to human-wildlife cooperation studies. Her work was groundbreaking, but Clay suspected she stayed as much for family as for science. "I've been thinking about Tom a lot lately," Sarah said, as they paused near the memorial stone Clay had placed beside the main trail. Tom's name was carved in the granite, along with the simple inscription, "He died protecting what he loved." "What about him?" "About whether he'd be proud of what you've built here." Clay considered the question, looking around at the sanctuary that had grown from a moment of desperate trust between a dying cub and a guilty hermit. Tom had believed in protection over destruction, in taking responsibility for vulnerable things, in standing up for what was right even when it was dangerous. "I think he'd be amazed," Clay said finally. Not at the sanctuary, but at the fact that his grumpy older brother finally learned to ask for help. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying clearly in the mountain air. "You've gotten pretty good at accepting help and giving it." They completed their evening rounds and returned to the cabin, where Clay prepared his simple dinner while Sarah updated her research notes. The domesticity of their routine was punctuated by the sounds of wild lions settling into sleep, soft vocalizations between mother and cubs, the rustle of movement in the nearby forest, the profound peace of predators that had found their place in the world. Before bed, Clay stepped onto his porch for one final check on his charges. The mother lion was visible in the moonlight, a golden shadow among the pines. She lifted her head at his appearance, acknowledging his presence with the slight nod that had become their evening greeting. In 6 months, she'd grown from a desperate mother making an impossible choice to the matriarch of a thriving family. Her cubs had survived and flourished, her new litter was healthy and strong, and she'd claimed territory that no male would challenge because it was protected by laws and fences and humans who understood the value of what she represented. Clay had grown too, from a hermit haunted by guilt to a guardian surrounded by chosen family. The sanctuary employed 12 people, educated thousands of visitors each year, and served as a model for wildlife facilities across the country. But its real achievement was simpler. It had proven that wild hearts and human hearts could sometimes find common ground in the simple act of protecting what they loved. As Clay prepared for sleep, he could hear the cubs' soft breathing through the window that faced their enclosure. In the morning, there would be feeding schedules and veterinary checks, research data to collect and visitors to educate. But tonight, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a day well lived in service to creatures that had asked for his protection and received it. 30 years ago, Clay had lost his brother to a moment of misunderstood sacrifice. 6 months ago, he discovered that love sometimes looked like taking impossible risks for impossible creatures. Tonight, surrounded by the sounds of a family that spanned species and defied every rule about wild and tame, Clay Dawson slept the peaceful sleep of a man who'd found his place in the world. Outside, the mother lion kept her eternal vigil, but she was no longer alone. She was part of something larger now, a family, a sanctuary, A testament to the possibility that trust could bridge any gap, heal any wound, protect any treasure worth saving. The mountain valley held them all in its embrace, wild and human together, proving that some families were chosen, some homes were earned, and some love was strong enough to rewrite the rules of the possible.